Hercule Poirot and the telephone that ran alone. Chapter 1. The Call of Midnight. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 12 o'clock when the first chime rang in the Delacroix house. It was one of those nights when even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the darkness itself were listening. In the heart of the elegant Passy district, west of Paris, the Delacroix family mansion was plunged into a thick silence, broken only by the distant hum of electric lights. And yet the phone rang again. Claire Delacroix, her silk robe still half open and her hair hastily tied back, descended the marble steps with careful steps. Her face was pale, not only because of the unsociable hour, but because this was the third time the phone had rang that night, and neither time had there been anyone on the other end of the line. No one, except a brief whisper, almost a gasp, which ended abruptly in a cold, decisive click. "Oui, who's speaking?" Claire asked, picking up the receiver with trembling fingers. Only silence. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She hung up sharply. That same morning, the family lawyer had officially handed over the will of her late husband, Lucien Delacroix, who had died just 3 weeks earlier of an apparent heart attack. The inheritance was considerable. Property in Lyon, shares in a shipping company, and a modest mansion in Marseille. Everything was going to Claire, or so it seemed. But that night, Claire began to doubt that Lucien was really dead. The next morning, under a still thick mist, Hercule Poirot was contemplating his cup of coffee in the dining room of the Hôtel Meurice, dressed in his usual elegance, a pearl-grey jacket, an impeccably waxed moustache, and a handkerchief folded with mathematical precision. He was absent-mindedly leafing through the pages. Le Figaro, until his gaze stopped on a brief headline. Businessman's widow reports anonymous calls from her late husband's phone. Poirot raised an eyebrow. He placed the newspaper carefully, and after a brief, thoughtful silence, muttered to himself, "A phone that calls by itself, or a ghost with a sense of humour." As if fate were responding to her thought, at that very moment a letter arrived, a missive written with nervous strokes on linen paper, lightly scented with lavender. "Mr. Poirot, I know this may sound absurd, even hysterical, but I beg you to listen to me. There's something wrong with this house. The phone rings every night, always at the same time, and there's no one on the other end. Yesterday, one of the mirrors in Lucien's office appeared cracked from the inside. I'm begging you to come. I can't trust anyone else. The police think I'm losing my mind. Claire Delacroix, 21, Rue de la Paix." Passy Poirot read it carefully. Then he folded it neatly, stood up with the serenity of someone who has already decided his fate, and said to the waiter, "Take away the breakfast, my friend. This morning I have a date with a ghost, or a very nervous liar." Poirot's black car pulled up in front of the Delacroix house an hour later. The mansion was an imposing structure, with stone flower beds and Corinthian columns at its entrance. However, in Poirot's eyes something was off. "Too much symmetry," he murmured, "like a face that smiles while hiding a grimace." Claire greeted him at the door. She was a woman in her 40s, still elegantly beautiful, but clearly marked by sleepless nights. Her voice was gentle, but her gaze had the rigidity of someone forcing herself not to break. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot. I know this sounds Ridiculous. Ridiculous, madame, to assume that inexplicable things don't deserve explanation, he replied with a slight bow. Show me your phone. He led her into the office. It was a large room with dark wood bookshelves, an oil portrait of Lucien on the wall, and an antique rotary telephone on a walnut table. It's been ringing here every night since last Tuesday, Claire said. Poirot looked at the device without touching it. Then he turned on his heel and slowly scanned the room, as if gauging the atmosphere of the place more than the objects themselves. And who else lives here with you, madam? My sister-in-law, Giselle Delacroix, the butler, Henri, and the maid, Sophie. Since Lucien's death, we haven't had any visitors. And the phone, is it connected to a private switchboard? No, it's a direct line, but we already checked. There are no records of incoming calls. So, madame, the culprit isn't on the other end of the wire. He's here, in this house, and he has a reason to make you believe the past has returned. Claire looked at him, incredulous. Poirot gave a brief smile. Every crime, madame, begins with an intention, and no intention is hidden forever. Chapter 2. The House of Closed Doors. The butler, Henri, a man of uncertain age with a marble face and a discreet gait, served tea with almost ceremonial movements, while Poirot and Claire sat in the room adjoining, the office. Through the window, faint rays of winter sunlight filtered in, painting oblique lines on the Persian carpets and gilt mouldings. Tell me, madame, Poirot began, stirring the tea without tasting it yet. Did your husband, Monsieur Lucien Delacroix, suffer from any heart condition before his death? Claire slowly shook her head. None that I knew of. Although lately he'd been acting nervous, listening for noises, for calls that didn't exist. He said someone was snooping around in his past. Poirot slightly inclined his head, interested, and you believed him. Not at first, Claire confessed, lowering her voice. I thought it was stress. The shipping business was going through tough times, and your sister Giselle, she was always a troubled presence. But now, she trailed off, her fingers tightening around her cup. Now I'm not so sure about anything. A sharp knock at the door announced the arrival of Madame Giselle Delacroix. Tall, elegant, and with the haughty bearing of someone who knows she's being watched, Giselle entered without waiting for an invitation. Her lips were painted crimson, and her voice, when she spoke, had the edge of a carefully honed knife. So this is the famous Monsieur Poirot. Have you come to hunt ghosts, detective? Poirot stood up politely with a slight bow of his head. I only hunt for truths, madam. And sometimes ghosts are a way of hiding them. Giselle laughed without humour. My brother got carried away by superstitions, and died as he lived, distrusting everyone. Claire still hasn't gotten over it, as you can see. Please don't talk to me as if I'm not there, Claire said firmly, placing her cup on the table with a soft click. This house is becoming a place of madness, and you know more than you're letting on, Giselle. Tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. Poirot watched without intervening, his dark eyes moving between the two women. Would you mind if I inspect your late husband's office more closely? She asked, breaking the silence. I'd like to study the environment from which these calls are coming. Go ahead, Claire said instantly. Is it necessary? Giselle chimed in, raising an eyebrow. "That's all right, madame," Poirot agreed. "A crime scene, even an invisible one, always reveals more than meets the eye. Lucien's office was a mixture of maniacal order and accumulated melancholy." Poirot walked slowly around the place, letting his eyes rest on every detail. Perfectly lined-up books, a framed photograph of Claire and Lucien at the port of Marseille. A mantel clock stopped at 11:58. Poirot paused before the telephone. He stroked the dial with his fingertip. Then he looked at the small glass tray next to the receiver. On it, a light residue of dust contrasted with a cleaner circular fingerprint. "Funny," he murmured. "What is it, monsieur?" Claire asked from the doorway. "This phone has been picked up recently, but no one has wiped it. I mean, someone has used it, but not from this end of the line." Poirot bent down and examined the wiring. Then he walked to the bookshelf and scanned a row of books until he stopped at one, titled Wireless Telegraphy Theory and Applications. He gently pulled it out. As he did so, a slight draught of air escaped from the slot behind the books. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A vent?" he asked aloud. Claire approached. "I don't know. Lucien never told me about that. Nor would he have done so if he were someone who trusted secrets more than locks," Poirot replied. He turned to her. "Is there another room adjoining this office?" "Just the reading room. Giselle uses it as a private room." "And is there a door between them?" "Yes, but it's been closed for years. Lucien had it sealed due to disuse. Can I see her?" A few minutes later, Poirot was inspecting the aforementioned sealed door, whose edges showed recent signs of having been opened and closed again. The paint had a slight crack at the bottom, and the dust on the floor, barely visible, was disturbed. "A house with many closed doors, madame," Poirot said gently. "Sometimes the most important ones are the ones that lead to the past." Claire looked at him, uneasy. "Do you think Lucien had enemies?" "That's not the right question. The real question is, who wanted Lucien to believe he had enemies?" Poirot turned around, the gleam in his eyes brighter than ever. "Madam, I ask you to call everyone who lives in this house. Tonight we'll have dinner together, and we'll listen to the telephone." Chapter 3. Echoes at Dinner. Dinner at the Delacroix mansion was served promptly at 8, as Poirot had ordered. In the oval dining room, decorated with crystal chandeliers and carved oak panelling, the atmosphere was tense, almost ceremonial. The table was set with pinpoint precision, yet it was clear that no one present had an appetite. Claire, dressed in black as if she were still mourning beyond protocol, played with her fork without taking a bite. Giselle, on the other hand, seemed strangely relaxed, sipping her wine with measured slowness. Beside her, Sophie, the maid, stood like a statue, ready to pour, although she cast discreet sidelong glances at Poirot. Henri, the butler, remained in the shadows, as if he were part of the furniture. "Gentlemen," Poirot began in his characteristically calm tone, "I'm not looking for a pleasant conversation tonight. I'm looking for an answer, one that, if you don't give me, the telephone will." The rustling of cutlery stopped. "Do you think the phone will ring again?" Claire asked quietly. "I'm convinced of that, madame," Poirot replied without hesitation, "and I want to see with my own eyes and ears how each of you will react when I do." Giselle gave a dry laugh. Are you going to psychoanalyze us based on a ringtone? Isn't that a little theatrical? Oh, madam, you will understand that sometimes the theatre is the only way to discover a carefully disguised truth. The diners ate in silence for a few more minutes. Outside, the rain was beginning to patter against the windows. Poirot watched every gesture. The almost imperceptible tremor of Claire's hand as she drank water, the restrained rigidity of Henri's posture, the way Sophie averted her gaze whenever Lucien was mentioned. At 11:55, Poirot got up. I would appreciate it if you would accompany me to the office. Everyone obeyed without speaking. The atmosphere was like that of a waiting room before surgery. In the office, the telephone lay harmlessly, as if unable to disturb the prevailing calm. Poirot stood beside the device. He took out his pocket watch and consulted it. 2 minutes left. This is absurd, Henri muttered. The truth often seems absurd just before it is revealed, Poirot replied. The second hand on the clock ticked by with exasperating slowness. No one was breathing normally. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, the telephone rang. Sigh. Claire flinched. Sophie clapped her hand to her mouth. Giselle, on the other hand, just stared at the device, her expression almost satisfied. Poirot raised a hand. No one was to come near. Sigh. Then, suddenly, the ringing stopped. The silence it left behind was more disturbing than the sound itself. Poirot calmly approached and picked up the receiver. He held the receiver to his ear for several seconds. His face remained impassive. Finally, he hung up. Absolute silence, but the line was active. It wasn't a system error. Claire took a step forward. So, who's calling? Where are they from? That's the question we'd all like to answer. And believe me, madame, we'll know. Poirot turned to Henri. Is there any way to access the basement from this wing of the house? Henri looked surprised. Yes, sir. There's a trapdoor next to the boiler room, but it hasn't been used for years. Please, guide me. As they walked down the corridor, Poirot noticed that Giselle wasn't accompanying them. The woman remained in the study, looking at her brother's portrait with a cryptic smile. The basement was damp, with a scent of old wood and charcoal. Henri turned on a flashlight and shone it toward the metal trapdoor that led to a secondary gallery. Poirot bent down, inspected the rusty latch, and then forced it open. The flashlight illuminated a short stone staircase. Who else knew about this entry? Just Mr. Lucien. And me. Maybe Miss Giselle in her youth. Poirot descended carefully. The corridor was narrow, with brick walls and a single wooden door at the end. Pushing through it, they discovered a tiny windowless room with an electrical panel, a dusty chair, and most importantly, a second telephone, identical to the one in the office. Poirot approached. The dust on the telephone had been recently disturbed. There you go, he whispered. This is where the calls are made. A phone connected internally to the office phone. No electrical mystery. Just a forgotten passage and someone who knew it well. They walked steadily back to the main floor. Poirot re-entered the office, where Claire, Sophie, and Giselle were waiting. The latter raised an eyebrow. Any news, sir? Poirot looked at her directly. Only the house has told us a little secret. And now, madame, the mystery has changed its Tone. We no longer ask who makes the calls, but because. Chapter 4. The Voice That No One Recognized. The next morning, a pale sun bathed the gardens of the Delacroix mansion, but the warmth of the day didn't reach the interior of the house, where every corner seemed charged with an invisible tension. Poirot was having breakfast on the back terrace with Claire, who had barely slept. "The phone in the basement," she murmured. "How come no one knew?" "Someone knew, madam. They knew it precisely, and they used it to play with your perception. Sometimes a crime doesn't begin with a death, but with a slowly planted idea." Claire held her cup with both hands. "Do you think Lucienne also received those calls?" "It's possible," Poirot replied gently. "And if so, it might explain his nervousness before he died. But it's even more interesting to ask, what was the caller looking for? Scare him? Push him to his limits?" Claire looked away at the rosebush. Giselle and Lucien. They never got along, but I can't imagine her doing something like that. She loves this house even more than her own brother. Henri is discreet, yes, but faithful. And Sophie? "The maid is afraid, madame. Not of ghosts, but of the living. That tells us a lot." Poirot elegantly placed the napkin on the table. "I need to do something different today, a perception experiment. Would you allow me to summon the three of you, Giselle, Henri, and Sophie, to the main hall this afternoon? A meeting, yes, but not like last night. This time it won't be the phone talking, it will be them. And I will watch how their words move." At 5 o'clock sharp, the three invited guests were seated in the living room. Giselle, with a long cigarette between her fingers. Henri, stiff in a corner. Sophie, with her eyes lowered and her fingers interlaced in her lap. Poirot, standing by the unlit fireplace, began his monologue in a casual tone. "Thank you for coming. Today I won't talk to you about telephones, or ghosts, or even the death of Monsieur Lucien Delacroix. Today I'll talk to you about a voice that belongs to no one, and yet you all know it." Giselle exhaled the smoke with forced elegance. "Are you going to interrogate us again, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oh, no, madam. I'll just ask each of you a very simple question." He turned to Henri. "Do you remember what Mr. Lucien's voice was like?" Henri frowned. "Of course, firm, calm. A little hoarse when she got irritated." Poirot nodded. Then he turned to Sophie. "And you, mademoiselle?" "He was gentle, but always spoke with authority. He didn't like repetition. He'd say something only once." Poirot finally turned to Giselle. "And you, madame?" She looked at him without hesitation. He had the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders, not the kind who shouts, the kind who compels obedience with just a sentence. Poirot walked over to a small table on which rested a portable tape recorder, one of the most modern recording models. He turned it on. "Good. What you're about to hear was recorded last night, during the call we all witnessed. It's brief. Listen carefully." He pressed the button. An electric crackle preceded a faint sound, a shaky breath, and then a distorted voice, barely a whisper. "Claire, it's not over yet." Poirot switched off the device. The ensuing silence was absolute. "That voice?" he asked softly. "Does it belong to Mr. Lucien?" No one responded immediately. Claire, who had entered unnoticed by the others, stood in the doorway, pale as marble. "No," Giselle finally said, her tone strained. "It's not her voice. It's younger." Henri looked confused. "I couldn't say. It could be him, but thinner, weaker." Sophie suddenly blurted out, "No, that voice isn't Monsieur Delacroix's. I've heard it before. In this house." Everyone looked at her. "Where?" asked Poirot gently. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then looked down. "One night, 2 weeks ago. I heard her coming from the library. I was cleaning the glassware. It sounded like someone was rehearsing words. And when I walked in, the room was empty. And why didn't he say anything? I thought it was my imagination." Moreau leaned towards her. "Was that Henri's voice?" "No, it wasn't him," he replied instantly. "From Madame Giselle?" "No, not either." Poirot nodded. Then he raised his index finger. "So, if it wasn't any of you, who's been practicing speaking?" In the late Lucien's voice, a charged silence was the only response. Poirot stepped forward. "I've asked a technician to analyze the recording. There are signs of electronic manipulation. An imitated voice, modified. But to imitate a voice, you first have to know it, and know it very well." Giselle dropped the cigarette. "Are you suggesting that someone used a device to simulate your voice?" "I'm not implying it, I'm stating it. The technology exists even if it's not common. But the most important thing is not as did it, but so that, and that's where we enter the realm of motives." Claire stepped forward slowly, her voice breaking. "So, someone wanted me to believe Lucienne was alive. Not only that, madame, I wanted to destroy her confidence, her credibility, her emotional balance, because a woman on the edge of reason is easy to invalidate, and even easier to manipulate." Poirot turned to the others. "Tomorrow, I'll visit your notary, because I'm convinced this game began long before Lucien's death, and the key is in the documents. In the meantime, madame," he looked at Claire, "do not leave your room tonight, and lock the door." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Broken. The next morning, Poirot left the Delacroix mansion early, his cane and hat carefully arranged, and a thin folder under his arm. His destination was the Deschamps and Frères notary office, located in a stately building near the Place Vendôme, where Lucien Delacroix's personal lawyer, Maître de Victor Renaud, received him with a mixture of courtesy and suspicion. "Monsieur Poirot," Renaud said, ushering him into his office, "I'm surprised to see you discussing this matter. Do you suspect any irregularity in the will?" "No irregularity." "A contradiction, perhaps?" Poirot replied, settling into a leather armchair. "I'm interested in the change of will that occurred before Monsieur Delacroix's death. I understand there were 2 versions, an earlier one and a more recent one." Renaud nodded. "That's right. The first will, dated 1933, left the majority of the estate to his wife, Claire, and a smaller portion to his sister, Giselle. The second, drawn up in September of last year, modified that. It increased Giselle's share considerably. It practically equalized the shares." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Curious. And why such a drastic change?" Renaud shrugged. Mr. Delacroix expressed dissatisfaction with some of his wife's decisions. He spoke of emotional disloyalty. Nothing, concrete, but his attitude was different. He also mentioned feeling manipulated, under surveillance. He confessed to my secretary that he believed Claire was hiding something important. And did he leave some kind of attached letter? A special clause? Yes, a handwritten, sealed letter, ordering that if Claire was declared mentally unstable or engaged in suspicious acts after her death, her share would be held in trust for Giselle. Ah, Poirot murmured. A very specific clause. And who had the authority to determine this instability? A panel of doctors chosen by Giselle herself. Legal, though questionable. Poirot stood up slowly. Mr. Renaud, may I have a copy of both versions, just so I can study them more closely? Of course, although I don't understand what this has to do with those late-night calls you mention in your letter. Everything is connected, Maître Renaud. In crimes of manipulation, words are the bullets, and inheritance is the gun. Back at the mansion, Poirot found Claire in the library, silently leafing through a photo album. Upon seeing him enter, she immediately closed it. Well? He asked. Have you discovered anything? Several things, all disturbing. But there's one that haunts me more than the rest. Which? Poirot sat opposite her. Why did your husband believe in your last months that you were hiding something from him? Claire sat up in surprise. No, I don't. There were no secrets between you. Claire pressed her lips together. Well, I didn't tell him everything. I didn't want to worry him. Madam, in cases of manipulation, silence is the guilty party's best ally. Claire looked down. After a few seconds, she spoke. Lucien found a letter. It was old, written by his mother before she died. It spoke of a legitimate heir outside of marriage, a son who had been given up for adoption. Poirot straightened up. An illegitimate child? Yes. Lucien became obsessed with it. He began to suspect everyone. He even believed that Henri, the butler, could be that son, or someone sent by him. And what did you do with the letter? He burned it. I begged him to keep it, but he said it would only bring misfortune. From then on, his character changed. He began to see everyone as an enemy. It was shortly after that he changed his will. Poirot nodded, the petite cells grises working at full speed. And you? Do you think that letter was real? I don't know, Monsieur Poirot. But someone in this house did know, and used it. That afternoon, Poirot discreetly summoned Henri to the garden. The butler greeted him with his usual neutrality. Henri, said Poirot, how long have you been in the service of this house? 27 years, sir. So you knew Mr. Lucien from a young age, since I was 16. Did he ever confess anything personal to you? Any suspicions about your lineage? Henri hesitated. Then he said, almost in a whisper, Once, when I was about 20, he called me into his office. He asked me if I had any memories of my mother. I told him no, that I'd been raised in a parsonage. He looked thoughtful, and then never mentioned it again. Poirot studied him carefully. And you? Did you ever feel there was something special about your bond with him? He always treated me with respect, but also with distance. Poirot nodded. So maybe you weren't the intended recipient of that letter. But someone wanted it to look that way. The butler frowned. Do you think all this, the calls, the fake voice, Madame Claire's fear is to make her seem unstable. Exactly. To activate the clause in the will. And if that happens, Giselle will inherit everything. Henri narrowed his eyes. But Giselle isn't technically skilled enough to set up a recording or voice fake system. No, it isn't. But I could use help. Someone young. Someone inside the house, or near it. Someone who's learned to navigate the corridors and the technology. Henri looked at him intensely. Sophie? Poirot didn't reply. He just said, "Tonight, I need everyone to stay in their rooms. Except you. You'll accompany me to the library at midnight. What do we expect to find?" Poirot smiled slightly. A truth that doesn't sound like any voice, but that is heard in the footsteps of those who believe that everyone else is asleep. Chapter 6. The Mirror and the Shadow. Night fell upon the Delacroix mansion with a thick calm, as if the house itself were holding its breath. All the clocks struck 11:30, when Poirot, with his ivory walking stick and carefully buttoned coat, descended silently to the library, where Henri was already waiting for him, an oil lantern in his hand. "Everyone in their rooms?" asked Poirot. Henri nodded. "Madame Claire locked the door as you instructed. Giselle is in her room, reading. Sophie left an hour ago. Perfect. Now, Monsieur Henri, come with me. Let's wait for the ghosts." They both sat in the darkest corner of the library, by the unlit stove, the lantern wrapped in a handkerchief so as not to betray their presence. Poirot took out his pocket watch and watched the second hand tick by. "What exactly are you looking for, Monsieur Poirot?" Henri whispered. "A figure, a shadow, an intention." Time passed slowly, and the tension grew like a rope stretched to its limits. Shortly after midnight, a faint creak was heard at the opposite end of the room. Poirot raised an eyebrow, and Henri held his breath. A silhouette appeared at the entrance of the library. The figure stealthily walked over to the desk, turned on a small portable lamp, and crouched down beside it. From one of the side drawers, he removed something wrapped in black cloth, a portable tape recorder. Then, without turning it on yet, he placed a second object on the desk, a sealed envelope. Poirot, with a firm gesture, jumped up and shone the flashlight directly at the figure. "Stop, right there!" The figure turned with a gasp. It was Sophie. Henri uttered a barely audible oath. "Mademoiselle Sophie!" exclaimed Poirot with measured gravity. "What in the world are you doing handling a recording device in the middle of the night?" The young woman put her hands to her face, trembling. "It's not what it looks like. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "Then explain yourself," said Poirot, approaching without taking his light off her. "You have 1 minute before your silence condemns you." Sophie lowered her head. "Giselle asked me for help 2 months ago. She said Lucien had left instructions to retrieve a letter that mentioned an illegitimate child. She had me look for it in the office file, and we found it. A real letter? I don't know, but it seemed very old. Giselle wouldn't let me read it all. She just told me that if that letter got out, Claire would lose her entire inheritance, and that Lucien would have wanted his royal son to inherit everything." Poirot watched her closely. "And the recorder?" Sophie swallowed. It was my idea, partly. I knew how to manipulate recordings, how to change tones, distort voices. I studied sound a bit before entering domestic service. I recorded a line from Lucien, from an old tape in his office. Then Giselle told me what to say, and I modified it so it sounded like he was speaking from beyond the grave. And the calls? I used the basement phone. Henri never went down there. I slipped in through the trapdoor in the north wing, the one that leads to the old laundry room. I had fake keys to various entrances. I made the calls in the middle of the night to make Claire doubt his sanity, and to make the others think the house was haunted. Henri took a step toward her, furious. And all this just for money? Sophie raised her head, her eyes shining. No, I didn't ask for money. She promised to help me get into the conservatory, to get out of here. She told me that if Claire was declared unstable, she'd have access to everything, and she'd protect me. Poirot sighed, crossing his arms. And this envelope? It's the original letter. I was going to give it to him tonight, but something changed. I started to feel watched, as if Lucien really was watching from somewhere. I regretted it, and Poirot took the envelope and opened it with great care. He read it in silence for a few seconds. Fascinating, he murmured. The handwriting is from Lucien's mother. And yes, it speaks of a son born out of wedlock, given up for adoption. There's no name, but there is a date, and a description of a mole on the left shoulder. Henri polled. Poirot looked at him slowly. Something to say, Monsieur Henri? The butler, his voice breaking, replied, I have a mole like that. I've always had it. Sophie gasped. So, it was you? Poirot raised a hand. No, we can't say for sure yet. It could be a coincidence. But it's clear someone used this letter as a latent threat. Not to do justice, but to twist it. Claire appeared in the doorway, alerted by the commotion. Bien, what's going on? Poirot turned to her. The truth is beginning to emerge, madame, but there are still loose ends. Would you like to gather everyone together tomorrow at noon? Claire nodded slowly. Poirot looked towards the window, where the reflection in the office mirror seemed to be watching them. The shadows have spoken, but they have not yet said their name. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Son. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Delacroix mansion was thicker than ever. The huge air was thick with silence, and all the house's inhabitants seemed to move like figures trapped in a still painting. Claire paced the greenhouse with a distracted expression. Henri never left the kitchen, and Sophie, confined to her room, hadn't said a single word since her nighttime confession. Only Giselle seemed immune. She came down late, as if the previous night had never happened, dressed in a grey velvet outfit and with a courteous smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Where is Monsieur Poirot?" she asked the butler in a friendly voice, who simply pointed toward the office. There, Poirot was reviewing the recovered letter for the 4th time. He had it open on the table, next to a folder containing the wills and a notebook in which he had written lines and names. When he saw her enter, he didn't get up. "Madame Giselle, I'm glad to see you in a good mood this morning." "Should I be worried, monsieur? Should I?" repeated Poirot, inclining his head. "Sometimes, madame, concern reveals more than any confession." Giselle sat down with studied naturalness in front of him. They've already told me everything. Little Sophie betrayed my trust. She manipulated everyone, recorded those voices, sowed chaos, and you exposed her. Very well done." Poirot watched her closely. "And you, madame, do you consider yourself a victim of his schemes? Of course, she used me. She wrapped me up in her paranoia. She was ambitious, young, easily dazzled." Poirot slowly interlaced his fingers. "Funny. She says you were the one who taught her how to use the recorder, that you selected the lines, that the motivation wasn't money, but power." "Absurd," Giselle interrupted, though a bit too quickly. "I didn't touch any of the equipment. I have no idea how those modern things work." Poirot nodded without arguing. "And yet, madame, something intrigues me. Why feign such ignorance when you yourself wrote in a letter to Lucien in 1939 that the new phonograph machines were a delight for preserving memories? I have the letter in the archives." Giselle paled slightly. "I don't remember saying." "That I do," Poirot said with a brief smile. "And I don't forget, nor does ink." At noon, as agreed, Poirot gathered all the house's inhabitants in the main drawing-room. The armchairs were arranged in a semicircle, as if for a small performance. Claire sat with her hands clasped together. Henri sat stiff as a column. Sophie sat nervous, her eyes swollen. Giselle sat like a queen without a throne. Poirot walked to the centre of the room with a measured step, his moustache gleaming, and his walking stick leaning with mathematical precision next to the fireplace. "Mesdames, messieurs, the moment has arrived. For days, this house has been the scene of a psychological drama, a work designed to cast doubt on Madame Delacroix's sanity, to tarnish her name, and call into question her inheritance. The instrument of this plan was fear and the medium, a false voice speaking from the grave." "And Sophie is the culprit?" Giselle asked sharply. Poirot raised a hand. "Not so fast, madam. Yes, Sophie manipulated recordings, but she was used. Promises of the future, of opportunities. She was a pawn, not the mastermind." Giselle crossed her arms. "So who—" Poirot raised the letter with a dramatic gesture. This letter was the spark, an ancient document mentioning an illegitimate child, a hidden heir. Whoever knew of its existence could use it to manipulate wills. "And testaments," Claire intervened, her voice low. "But was it real?" "Oui, madam. The handwriting, the paper, the ink, all authentic. But there's no name, only a date of birth, a physical description. Just one concrete fact, a mole on the left shoulder." Everyone turned to Henri, who didn't move. "I have him," he said without emotion, "and if this letter is true, then I am that son." Poirot walked towards him. "That may be, but that doesn't change anything, because you never acted as an heir. You didn't seek anything. You never benefited from the chaos." "I didn't know that," Henri replied sadly. "Exactly. The real criminal isn't the one who hides an origin, but the one who uses it." Poirot turned slowly towards Giselle. "Madame, you had access to the letter. You manipulated Sophie. You pressured to change the will. Do you deny it? What if I don't deny it? What if I say I did it to defend my brother's legacy? To protect him from a woman who poisoned him with tenderness? Claire never truly loved him. She just tolerated him. She wanted the inheritance. I knew her from the beginning. No, madam, you weren't protecting your brother. You were protecting your own ambition. You wanted the house, the name. And when you learned of the illegitimate son's existence, you used him as a ghost. Because, if Lucien died fearing his wife, you won. Giselle stood up, drawing herself up haughtily. And I would have succeeded if that damn girl hadn't changed her mind. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, madame. But the truth always finds a crack, and this house is full of cracks. The others remained silent. Claire, with tears in her eyes. Sophie, with her gaze fixed on the ground. Henri, with the dignity of someone who suddenly discovers he has a different story. Poirot signalled. Outside, 2 agents were waiting. Madame Giselle Delacroix, you are under arrest for fraud, manipulation, and attempted testamentary deception. Your brother died of natural causes, yet you have attempted to murder his memory. Giselle said nothing. She just walked toward the door, her bearing intact, but her gaze blank. That evening, Poirot took his suitcase and prepared to leave the house. Claire accompanied him to the entrance. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. You saved my life, or at least the part of it that was still worth something. Poirot smiled. I only made the shadows speak, madame. They already knew the truth. Chapter 8. Resting Grey Cells. The day after Giselle's arrest, the sky over Paris dawned clear, with a clarity that seemed to be reflected in the atmosphere of the Delacroix mansion. For the first time in weeks, the silence was not oppressive, but peaceful. Claire, dressed in a sober grey ensemble, sat in the garden next to a small smoking samovar, watching the early shoots of the rosebush Lucien used to prune every spring. Poirot appeared with a measured stride, his coat hanging over his arm, and his walking stick perfectly aligned with his silhouette. Claire greeted him with a look that, although marked by exhaustion, seemed firmer than ever. "Wouldn't you like to stay another day, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, pouring him tea. "The house feels different without the shadows watching. Ah, madam, nothing flatters my little grey cells like knowing that order has been restored. But I mustn't stay. An old watchmaker from Lyon has written me a very intriguing letter about a crime without a body and involving a stolen pendulum. And besides, this house needs something I can't offer. Peace." Claire looked down, thoughtful. "Do you think Henri is really Lucien's mother's son?" Poirot raised an eyebrow gently. "The possibility is strong, madame. The mole, the date of birth, the parish education, all the elements match. But Henri, unlike the others, doesn't seek confirmation. He doesn't need to be an heir. He's already served this house for almost his entire life." "What if he decides to reclaim his place?" Claire asked, her tone neutral. Poirot adjusted his moustache thoughtfully. "Henri is not a man who demands, is a man who observes. And there is something noble in that. But, madame, if you wish the truth to be officially recognized, perhaps you should offer it yourself." Claire nodded, understanding the subtext. "The letter is still in my possession. I could give it to a notary, and share what Lucien never had. Time to face. That, madame, would be not only prudent, but just." They remained silent for a moment. The distant song of a blackbird pierced the air, like a timid music that the house didn't yet dare fully accept. And Sophie? Claire finally asked. What will become of her? Poirot tilted his head. Young Sophie made mistakes, yes, but she was also the victim of skillful manipulation. She's decided to leave. She'll seek employment in Lyon. With her knowledge of sound and restoration, she has a chance. If she chooses to redeem herself. Claire took a deep breath. We all wanted something. We weren't given, Lucienne, the family, even me, and that lack turned us into masks, into echoes. Poirot nodded solemnly. It's the tragedy of the human soul, madam, hiding who we are in order to survive, until someone lights a lamp in the right corner. Claire smiled for the first time, a small but genuine smile. And you? Have you ever hidden anything? Only my patent leather shoes when it rains. Poirot bowed gallantly. I don't like real secrets. They upset the balance. He stood up, ready to leave, but Claire stopped him with one last question. Monsieur Poirot, do you think Lucien knew all this? That he suspected Giselle? Poirot turned away thoughtfully. Lucien was an intelligent man. Though tired, I think he sensed it deep down. That's why he wrote the clause. That's why he changed his will. But he didn't have time to fully understand the web that was woven around him. And like many men caught between two truths, he died without being able to choose which to believe. Claire walked him to the front door. Henri was already waiting with the car running. Seeing the butler, Claire called out to him in a calm voice. Henri, before you leave, Monsieur Poirot, I want to give you something. He took a sealed envelope from his inside coat pocket, the original letter. Henri took it with trembling hands. Are you sure, madam? Yes, it belongs to you. It doesn't matter what you do with it. Just don't hide it again. Henri tucked it into his chest and lowered his head in respect. Poirot got into the car. As the vehicle moved off, Claire and Henri stood on the steps, two figures in the cold midday light. In the rearview mirror, Poirot watched as the mansion, which had remained so silent, now seemed to begin to tell its true story. And as the car turned the corner, the Belgian detective muttered to himself, "The phone no longer rings alone. Now, every voice knows who it belongs to." End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Epilogue with a last call. 3 weeks had passed since Hercule Poirot's departure. Paris had changed its face. Spring was advancing with a sure step, pushing green shoots to emerge even between the rusty bars of the iron gates. The Delacroix mansion was also beginning to transform, although at a more restrained pace. The police concluded their investigation with the formal arrest of Giselle Delacroix for fraud and manipulation, and the matter discreetly occupied the inside pages of Time, where high society scandals were written with white gloves. Claire had begun to rebuild her domestic life. Although the silence still weighed heavily, it was different. The house no longer whispered of doubts or conspiracies. Henri remained the butler, although now, from time to time, he also sat in the office chair, reviewing papers that would have previously seemed forbidden to him. Sophie was never heard from again, except for a brief letter sent from Lyon, where she said she had found work as a sound technician in a small independent theatre. But it was on a Tuesday afternoon, with the rain gently drumming on the windows, that something unexpected happened. The office phone rang again. Claire, in the library, immediately looked up. Her breathing stopped. It wasn't midnight, there wasn't a storm, and there wasn't any dramatic purpose behind it. Just a simple, straightforward doorbell. Sigh. Henri appeared at the door. "Do you hear that, madame?" "Yes." Claire stood up. They both walked together to the office. The sound continued. Sigh. Claire reached out and picked up the phone. "Hello. Who's speaking?" There was a brief buzz. Then a male voice, with an unmistakable Belgian accent, said, "Hello, Madame Delacroix. I just wanted to know, have you found peace in your home?" Claire smiled softly, relieved. "Monsieur Poirot, it's you. Yes, I've been thinking about you. About the letter, about the forgotten son, about the fallen masks. It seemed right to close this case not only with logic, but with humanity, who have sat by the phone. Everything's calmer. Henri, he's finding his place, I think. That makes me happy. And you, madame, have you found yours?" There was a brief pause. "Not yet, but at least this house doesn't scare me any more. I can walk around it without thinking someone's watching me. I can sleep and dream. That, madam, is the real closure. Criminals get caught, but emotional scars, they heal slowly. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." "Don't thank me. You were brave, more than you know." A soft click. Poirot had hung up. Claire slowly lowered the receiver. Looking at Henri, she noticed the man smiling with a newfound serenity. The envelope containing the letter was no longer in his drawer. He had handed it to a notary 2 days earlier, without asking for an inheritance, recognition, or revenge. Just truth. That same day, in a compartment on the train departing for Lyon, Poirot slipped his leather notebook into his coat pocket. Giu had jotted down one last line. "The most dangerous voice is not the one that shouts, but the one that whispers what we fear to hear." The train started moving. Poirot looked out the window as the rooftops of Paris gradually disappeared. His fingers polished the ivory handle of his walking stick. For a moment, amid the smoke from the locomotive, he thought he saw the outline of the Delacroix mansion. But it was only an illusion, just another reflection. And he, who had always trusted in the shadows to see the light, closed his eyes with a smile. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Silent Legacy. Summer arrived early in Paris that year, bringing with it a persistent light that filtered through the curtains even before dawn. The Delacroix mansion, for decades, a symbol of rigid order and closely guarded secrets, was now adapting to a new, simpler, more human routine. Claire had stopped sleeping in the master bedroom, not out of grief, but out of respect for the passage of time. The old guest bedroom, decorated in ivory tones and linen curtains, felt less oppressive. From there, she could hear the sparrows singing in the morning and the trees rustling at night. The everyday had become comforting. Henri, for his part, had officially renounced the title of butler. Claire offered him a different position, steward of the house and its assets. He accepted discreetly, although at first he felt uncomfortable, sitting at the same table as a woman who had bossed him around for years. However, as the days passed, between silent gestures and unfeigned glances, a sincere complicity emerged, woven not by blood, but by shared experience. One morning, Henri showed up with a folder in his hands. "Madam, sorry, Claire, I've been organizing the papers in the North Wing. I found this. The folder contained papers that Lucienne had filed away without anyone noticing. Correspondence with an orphanage, a series of receipts with coded names, and at the end, a short, unfinished manuscript." Claire read it silently. It was a letter Lucien seemed to have written to his lost heir. It wasn't dated or signed, but his words were filled with a tenderness Claire could hardly remember seeing in him. "If you ever read this, it means I didn't have the courage to find you in life. But time doesn't erase the debt. The only thing I can give you is the freedom to choose what to do with your past. I hope you use it wisely, and that you don't repeat my mistakes." Claire carefully closed the folder and placed it in front of Henri. "It's yours," he said. "He wrote to you, though he never actually gave this to you." Henri took her with firm hands. He didn't say anything, but Claire knew he understood. A few days later, a small event gathered a few close friends in the main hall. It was discreet, no music, no speeches. Claire signed the modification to the will. Henri was now listed as executor, not an heir, nor a recognized son on paper, but guardian of the legacy. At the end of the ceremony, as the guests left, Claire was left alone in Lucien's office. The telephone, now replaced by a modern model, lay silent. The new line hadn't rang once since Poirot's last call, not because she couldn't, but because there was no longer any need for her to speak. Claire placed Sophie's old tape recorder, disassembled and without tape, on the desk. She looked at it for a moment, then wrapped it in a linen cloth and put it in a drawer. "Echoes deserve rest too," he murmured. That same afternoon, in a small café along the Seine, Hercule Poirot received a wooden box sent from Passy. Inside was a bottle of aged cognac, a handwritten note, and a dried rose. "Mr. Poirot, for dear giving us back our reason when we feared we had lost it." Claire Delacroix Poirot smiled. He poured a small glass, swirled the liquid elegantly, and looked out the window. Life, he thought, doesn't always offer a clear culprit or a definitive answer, but it can offer redemption. And sometimes the most revolutionary thing isn't catching the killer, but gently closing a door. He raised his glass to the light. In truth. Always, Chapter 11. The Voice That Remains. Summer in Paris progressed uneventfully, but at the Delacroix mansion, the transformation continued with discreet steps. Doors that had been kept closed for years were finally opened. The music room, which Claire had avoided since Lucien's death, now served as Henri's studio, where he organized documents, restored old photographs, and spent hours reading the books he had never dared to touch. One afternoon, while reorganizing the family archive, Henri found a thin, unmarked envelope tucked between the pages of a naval ledger. Inside was a small recording tape labelled only with a date. May 4th, 1949. Henri, intrigued, took the tape to Claire. "I found it in a book in Lucien's office. It's not catalogued." Claire held it between her fingers, her expression thoughtful. "Do you want us to listen to it?" "Only if you wish, madam." "Yes. I want to know what Lucienne was keeping secret. One last time." The old portable tape recorder Sophie had left behind was still working, thanks to a recent repair ordered by Henri. Sitting in the library, surrounded by the soft evening twilight, they turned on the device and inserted the tape. The sound began with a faint crackling, followed by the familiar sound of a chair being dragged and laboured breathing, and then the voice. "This message is for me, for when I no longer know who to trust, for when I feel like the shadow has grown too large in this house. I read my mother's letter today, and I feel torn. The past gnaws at me like an animal hiding in the walls. Claire has been good to me, but there are times when she seems distant, alien, as if she knows something I don't. Giselle looks at me with pity, or maybe with calculation. Sometimes I think she's watching me more than caring. And Henri, is he? Could he be?" Claire and Henri looked at each other, but remained silent. "I've had a new will prepared. I know this will upset the balance, but I want to make it clear that if anyone tries to distort my wishes, it will be at their own risk. I don't trust anyone completely, but I trust what I'm capable of leaving behind when I'm gone. To anyone listening to this tape, if you've made it this far, it's because you've survived the network. Don't let the truth destroy you. Use the silence to rebuild what I shattered with my doubts." A soft click marked the end of the recording. Claire closed her eyes. Henri leaned back in his chair. For a few seconds, all he could hear was the faint hum of the tape recorder's motor. He knew, Claire finally whispered, not everything, but he knew his world was falling apart around him. Henri nodded, and yet he tried to leave something for whoever listened. A voice after the noise. What are we going to do with this recording? What he would have wanted. To keep it, but not hide it. Claire took out a wooden box and placed the ribbon inside, along with the letter from Lucien's mother and the unfinished manuscript. She gently closed the lid and slid it onto the centre shelf of the bookcase. Not to be displayed, but not to be forgotten either. That night, Claire wrote a letter. "Mr. Poirot, today we found one last tape of Lucien's. He didn't name names. He left only emotions and warnings. You were right. The most enduring crimes don't always stain hands, but hearts. This house at last is beginning to beat to its own beat. Perhaps it wasn't justice you brought, but balance, and sometimes that's enough." With affection, Claire, a few days later, in Brussels, Poirot opened the envelope. He read it leisurely. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his personal file labelled "The Phone Case Solved." He sighed contentedly. On his table, a cup of hot chocolate steamed next to a philosophy book. Outside, it was raining softly. The voice may fade, but the right echo always finds its place, he murmured, and with that he closed the case in his mind, like a chapter that leaves no wounds but a lasting lesson. End of Chapter 11. Final closure. Chapter 12. The House That Learned to Listen. Time passed. The seasons changed unhurriedly, and the Delacroix mansion, once immobile in its rigidity, began to take on a new rhythm. It was no longer just a setting for whispers and secrets, but a space where something different was built. Trust. Claire, increasingly comfortable in her unmasked widow's role, began opening the house to new voices. She organised small musical evenings in the reopened music room, where young artists played classical pieces in an intimate setting. The echoes of these melodies, rather than awakening painful memories, seemed to occupy the space that had previously belonged to guilty silence. Henri, for his part, became a quietly central figure, not as master or servant, but as part of the foundation. His relationship with Claire was one of deep respect and without labels. They never discussed whether he was the family's lost son. They didn't run tests, nor did they seek confirmation of blood. The past, they had agreed without words, was useful only to the extent that it served to understand each other, not define each other. One morning, Henri left for the market early. Claire was left alone at home, flipping through the newspaper in the reading room. Everything seemed peaceful until something interrupted the routine. A familiar sound, sigh. Claire raised her head, frozen. The new phone line, installed weeks ago, hadn't rung once. The sound was clear, modern. There was nothing ghostly about it. But in Claire's heart, something throbbed with an old-fashioned restlessness. He stood up slowly, crossed the hall to his office, where the receiver rested on the walnut table. He took a deep breath and picked up the receiver. There. On the other side, a jovial male voice answered, "Madame Delacroix? This is Etienne Marchal from the Lyon Conservatory of Music. I was told this was the line for referrals. We received a letter about a young woman named Sophie Durand. Would it be possible to speak for a few minutes?" Claire blinked in surprise. A smile, at first sceptical, spread across her face. Yes, of course. How is Sophie?" "Very good, according to your instructors. You show talent in audio restoration and have proposed a presentation on acoustic manipulation in domestic environments. Quite unusual, but with potential." Claire let out a light laugh. "That sounds absolutely appropriate. Would you be willing to send an additional letter of recommendation? Yours could be very influential." Claire looked at the phone for a moment as if she saw a sweet irony in it. "With pleasure. Tell Sophie that here, her house no longer blames her for anything, that we're all fine, that she can use her voice however she wants, as long as it's hers." He hung up with a sigh. For a few seconds he didn't move. Then he went to the desk, took out some stationery with a family letterhead, and began to write. That same afternoon, Henri returned from the market with a bouquet of fresh flowers under his arm. "I stopped by the florist. She said dahlias are arriving this week. Remember how Lucien always said they bloomed like they were crying out in a low voice?" Claire looked up from the piano where she was practicing, her hands still on the keyboard. "I remember. But now I prefer sounds that don't shout anything. Those that are just there, as accompaniment." Henri smiled. "Then these flowers will be perfect. They don't say anything. They just listen." Claire nodded. She put down the piano and helped him arrange the dahlias in a vase in front of the office window. For a moment they stood there in silence, watching the wind move the branches of the rose bush. Far away, in a discreet Brussels studio, Poirot was finishing organizing his files. The case of the telephone had been catalogued, closed, sealed, but not forgotten. On his office mantelpiece, a small gift rested next to his cane, a dried rose in a glass cube, and a handwritten note with a single sentence. "Thank you for giving us back our voice." Poirot stroked his moustache, satisfied. Houses don't talk, but they do. But they learn, and when they listen long enough, sometimes they even forgive. He closed the file, and with that, the case of the phone that called alone was buried under the weight of truth, redemption, and the echo of what no longer needed to be said. Chapter 13. The Silent Archive. In a forgotten wing of the National Library in Paris, where hanging lamps cast long shadows, and the air smelled of aged leather, a woman in a dark blue jacket meticulously pored over a catalogue of old phonograms. Her name didn't appear on any official list. Her hair was pulled back in a modest bun. Her name was Sophie Durand. Since leaving the Delacroix mansion, Sophie had kept a low profile. In Lyon, she reinvented herself as a restorer of sound archives, a profession in which silence was her ally and sounds were her museum pieces. Few knew of her past. Only her mentor at the conservatory knew anything about her story, and even he didn't fully understand the shadows that accompanied her. But Sophie didn't run away. She dug, that day, while checking a sealed box with the label private investigation files. Poirot came across something unexpected. A small wax cylinder labelled as Delacroix case, external copy, academic use. Sophie held her breath. She looked around. No one else was in the room. He took the cylinder to a recording booth and carefully inserted it. The sound crackled for a few seconds. Then he heard Poirot's calm, unmistakable voice. "I've kept a copy of this recording for human reasons, not legal ones. Sometimes echoes of truth must be preserved, not to accuse, but to remember." The voice continued, precisely narrating the sequence of events at the Delacroix mansion. The lost letter, the late-night calls, Claire's fear, Giselle's manipulation, and the final discovery of the illegitimate son who never claimed his place. Each sentence was clean, exact. It wasn't a summary. It was a testimony. Sophie listened with her eyes closed, as if the recording were a private atonement. Miss Sophie Durand, although a participant in the manipulation, showed remorse and a willingness to change. This document is not meant to judge her. It is meant to teach her, should she ever hear it, that mistakes once acknowledged need not be dragged out. They can truly be recycled. Sophie opened her eyes, glistening with tears. The recording ended with a soft sigh, a silence, and then a final sentence. The voice that lies skillfully, if it chooses to tell the truth, has more power than any confession. Sophie carefully removed the cylinder and returned it to its box. On the card, she wrote a marginal note. Heard by SD, with respect and responsibility, June 3rd. Then he walked to the filing cabinet, placed the box with Poirot's other cases, and allowed himself one last look at the booth, where the past had just spoken to him with unexpected clarity. That same day, in London, Hastings, now retired, received a handwritten letter from Poirot. The handwriting was firm, though more deliberate than in the old days. Mon cher Hastings, you might be surprised to know that I've left unofficial copies of a few select cases, not out of vanity, but because certain crimes aren't committed against the law, but against emotional stability. The Delacroix case was one of them. There was no murder, but there was pain, and manipulation, and redemption. I've always said that justice isn't enough. The human soul needs something more. Balance, yes, but also memory. Keep this letter, not for anyone to read, just for someone to have read it. With all my friendship, Poirot. Hastings kept the letter without telling anyone, like a voice heard in a dream. True, even if no one claims it. At the Delacroix mansion, Claire climbed the south tower every week. She had converted that old sewing room into a small reading room, a place where the wind blew in uncensored and where the voices of the past didn't frighten her. In a corner, she had left a modern tape recorder. It didn't record anything, but it played from time to time for pleasure. Soundscapes, waves, wind, birdsong, echoes without a message, just sound for pleasure. One afternoon, while arranging books, Claire whispered, "I don't need answers anymore, just silent company." And in the background, almost imperceptible, the sound of an old recording started playing again, as if the house were also learning to speak again. Chapter 14. The Notebook of the Last. Deduction. A week after the discovery at the National Library, Sophie found herself standing outside a second-hand bookstore on Rue des Écoles. Visiting antiquarian bookstores wasn't her style, but an unsigned note left in her locker at the conservatory had discreetly invited her. 7 Rue des Écoles. Look in the memoirs section. 3rd shelf, bottom. P. Curiosity. Always her strength, and her downfall drove her to cross the threshold. The interior smelled of dried ink, loose bindings, and a hint of mould. An older man with round glasses didn't even acknowledge her. He just nodded and continued reading an untitled book. Sophie walked to the indicated shelf. She scanned the volumes at the bottom until her fingers brushed against a brown, leather-bound notebook with no visible title. Inside, on the first page, she read with amazement, "Private Observations on the Delacroix Case. H.P." His heart leaped. The initials were unmistakable. The notebook wasn't an official report or a diary. It was a collection of personal reflections, written in Poirot's precise and elegant handwriting. Its pages contained no dates or documents, but human impressions, moral judgments, internal deductions not shared with the police or those involved, a psychological analysis of each player in the drama, including her. Sophie Durand, a brilliant mind boxed into a world that doesn't recognize her genius. She turned to illicit work, not out of ambition, but out of a thirst for courage. The voice she manipulated wasn't just Lucien's, but her own, distorted by fear. Redemption potential high. Sophie swallowed. He turned the page. Claire Delacroix. Emotional intelligence repressed by the weight of appearances. She doesn't trust love. Perhaps because she never received it freely. Able to face emptiness without collapsing. She didn't betray Lucien, but she didn't save him either. Henri, the true heir not to a fortune, but to a burden. Henri's loyalty was his shield, his silence, his strength. If he ever learns the full truth, he'll know how to use it. But he'll never demand it. That's nobility. Sophie continued reading, each word sinking deeper. Poirot spoke of the events not as a detective, but as a philosopher. He spoke of the damage caused by buried truths, of how technology can be an ally of crime, and of the need to teach the next generation to think before they speak. and on the last pages a more recent note, the ink still fresh, the handwriting less firm, read, "I've left this notebook where it can be found, not to be published, but to be read by those who still listen. Cases don't end with the arrest of a guilty party. They end when those who survived learn to live without lies." Sophie slowly closed the notebook. She didn't take it with her. She returned it to its rightful place on the shelf. As she left, the bookseller looked at her directly for the first time. "Have you found it?" "Yes," she replied, "and that's enough." Meanwhile, at the Delacroix mansion, Henri was finishing installing a new safe in the office. Claire, sitting in front of the fireplace, leafed through a book of memoirs by French lawyers. "Do you think everything will ever be known?" he asked without looking up. "All what?" "Everything Lucien hid. What Giselle manipulated. What we let slide." Henri approached with a small wooden box. He opened it, revealing an antique pocket watch. "Maybe not. But you don't need to know everything to live well. It's enough to understand what matters." Claire took the watch between her fingers. "And this?" "I found it in the hidden drawer of the north wing closet, engraved with the initials H.D., not mine, but someone's perhaps, who wanted to save something they never knew how to give away." Claire closed the watch. "Then you keep it. Maybe one day someone will come and claim it." That evening, at his desk in Brussels, Poirot reviewed his notes on another case. But before closing them, he added a line in a blank margin. "The truth shouldn't always be shouted. Sometimes it's enough to leave it on the right shelf, and trust that it will reach the right eyes." After all, he thought as he carefully stood up, not all crimes are punished, and not all redemptions are celebrated, but both, if understood well, teach us to live better. Chapter 15. The Last Echo. In the early hours of June 28th, the rain tapped gently on the roof tiles of the Delacroix mansion. Claire hadn't slept. For weeks the nights had been lighter, less tortured, but sleep remained a capricious visitor. That night she stood in the main hall, a blanket draped over her shoulders and a cup of tea in her hands. In front of her, the closed piano. She hadn't played it since Poirot's last visit. And yet, something in the dampness of the night, in that creaking silence filled with pauses, told her she should open it, not to play a piece, just to let her fingers find her voice. He struck a note, then another, a minimal arpeggio, as if the house were listening, not with its ears, but with its memory. Henri appeared in the doorway, silent. "Did I wake her?" Claire asked without turning around. "No, I was already awake. I dreamed about Lucien's mother." Claire turned slightly. "Did you know her?" Henri shook his head. "I only saw her in portraits. But in the dream, she spoke to me. She told me that a family's legacy isn't in the blood, but in what we leave behind for others." Claire smiled slightly. "Maybe it's true. Lucien left many things behind, but none as alive as what we built later." Henri approached the window. "Have you thought about selling the house?" "I did. For weeks, but I can't. Not because I'm clinging to her, but because I finally feel like we've given her voice back, and it doesn't seem right to silence her again." Henri nodded. His gaze fell on the corner where the old telephone had been. Now there was only an empty table, with a vase of open dahlias. And the new phone. Claire sighed. Disconnected. It never rang again after Poirot called. Maybe you don't need to. Claire put down her cup and stood up. Henri, there's something I want to show you. He led him into the office. He opened a small drawer in the desk and took out a copper key. This was the compartment Lucien used for confidential files. I never dared to open it. Until today, the lock turned with a metallic click. Inside lay a folder labelled with a single word, Echo. They opened it together. Inside were typewritten transcripts of Lucien's recordings, scattered fragments. Some were crossed out, others had marginal notes. But the most disconcerting thing was a loose sheet of paper with a title, Project Echo, Vocal Simulation System for Testimonial Preservation. Henri frowned. What is this? Claire read softly. The voice is the last vestige of the soul. If it could be preserved beyond death, it could offer comfort, warning, or guidance, not to deceive, but to record. But its misuse would be devastating. Henri looked at her, puzzled. Lucien designed a way to leave his voice alive. It seems so. Maybe he didn't follow through, but that would explain why his recordings were so well preserved. It wasn't paranoia. It was foresight. What if Giselle found out about this? Claire pressed her lips together. Then he realized he could use it against him. They fell silent. Then Claire closed the folder. It doesn't matter anymore. What could have been used as a weapon? We'll turn it into a legacy. We can send this to the Lion Conservatory. Let them study it with respect. Henri nodded, but before doing so, he removed a loose sheet of paper with an underlined paragraph. The voice that survives must do so with permission. Every recording requires consent. The real crime is not speaking for the dead, but putting words to them that they never said. That same night in Brussels, Poirot dreamed. He found himself in a long room, filled with old telephones, all lined up on endless tables. None of them rang, but as he drew closer, he heard voices, not as he picked up the phone, but before. Voices not asking for help, but for understanding. He woke gently. He sat up, put on his robe, and walked to his desk. There, in a locked box, lay Claire's letters, Hastings's notes, and the notebook of reflections on the Delacroix case. Poirot lit the lamp, took out a pen, and wrote one last line. The echo that doesn't seek to manipulate can become testimony, and testimony a lasting truth. Crime no longer lives here, only memory. He closed the notebook. He placed it in an envelope marked, to be read only if silence speaks again. Then he returned to bed. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees on the Rue des Tilleuls. And this time, Poirot slept without dreaming. Chapter 16. The Unsealed Envelope. It was a clear July morning when Claire found the envelope. It had no stamp, no address, just her name, written in firm, old-fashioned handwriting. Claire Delacroix. Someone had slipped it under the front door without ringing the bell. Henri, who had picked it up while sweeping the porch, handed it over without comment, although they both felt the air around the envelope felt a little heavier than usual. Claire held it silently for a few seconds before opening it. Inside, a single sheet of paper folded with geometric precision. Madame, if you're receiving this letter, it's because the echoes have decided to continue. Not with threats, not with ghosts. Only with questions that still await an answer. In 1945, her husband acquired a prototype recorder developed by engineer D. Leclerc of the Institut de Phonétique. The goal, to preserve the human voice in conditions of extreme fidelity. The technology was withdrawn from the market for ethical reasons, but Lucien insisted on keeping one unit. A copy of the original software remains stored. The activation code is as follows: Echo 1945 Vertex. Use it if you wish, or destroy it. The echo, once heard, can never be unheard. There was no signature, no clues. Claire carried the letter into the office and sat down at her desk. For long minutes she didn't move. She just stared at the note, the precise edges of the paper, the complete lack of emotion in the words. Henri appeared in the doorway. Should I be worried? No. But I need you to accompany me to Marseille. Marseille? Lucien had a property there. An old one closed since the war. He always said it wasn't worth restoring. But now I suspect he didn't want anyone to enter it. Henri narrowed his eyes. Do you think there... If there was a place to hide something like a voice file, this is it. 2 days later, after a discreet journey, they arrived at the modest Delacroix mansion on the hill of Notre-Dame-de-la-Garde. The building appeared abandoned, although structurally sound. The gate creaked as it opened. The interior was covered in sheets, dust, and silence. Claire lit a kerosene lamp. The rooms were empty, except for a hall at the back, double-locked. They used the old key Lucien had always kept in his shirts. Upon opening the door, they found themselves in a soundproof studio. In the centre, a large military-style tape recorder was connected to a series of metal coils and panels. A sealed box had the following engraved in gold letters: Truth, version A1. Claire approached. 3 options appeared on the devices. Screen as soon as it was turned on. Play testimony upload new coded delete file. Claire hesitated. Then, with steady fingers, she wrote, Echo 1945, Vertex. The system beeped twice. Then it displayed a single file. Lucien, reserved testimony, Chish Code of Ethics. 1. Are you sure? Henri asked. Lucien lived under so many assumptions. Maybe now we can hear his truth without intermediaries. Claire pressed reproduce. Tricon. Voice that emerged wasn't the muffled recording of the old tapes. It was alive, clear, as if Lucien were speaking from the other side of a window. If you're listening to this, Claire, it's because I didn't succeed. I didn't overcome doubt. It followed me like a shadow. I doubted you, Giselle, myself. I even doubted the son I never met. And I discovered I had a younger brother, the product of my mother's betrayal. They hid him. And when I looked for him, I found nothing. Then I met Henri, and I doubted him too. I watched him, as if an invisible scar connected him to me. But I never asked him. I didn't have the courage. Instead of facing the truth, I created mechanisms to monitor, to simulate, to prevent. I hurt you, Claire, not because of who you were, but because of what I feared you might be. Now that you hear me, I want to say I'm sorry. You were my balance. Giselle, my mirror. Henri, perhaps my blood. But you were all more loyal than I. I have stored this voice not to immortalize myself, but to avoid being misunderstood. Erase this if you wish for peace. Keep it if you believe it deserves to exist. The file stopped. Henri sat down without saying a word. Claire took a deep breath. Then, without consulting anyone, she stood up and pressed the power button. Delete file. The screen flashed. The system emitted a long beep. File deleted. Claire looked at Henri. Sometimes redemption isn't in being heard, but in stopping talking. Left the mansion without looking back. In Brussels, Poirot received an unsigned postcard. Just a single handwritten line. The echo has been silenced. The truth no longer needs to be repeated. Poirot read it, held it between his fingers for a few seconds, and then placed it on the fireplace, where it burned slowly and noiselessly. Finally, he murmured, the right silence in the right place always says the right thing. Chapter 17. The Picture That Never Hung. On the top floor of the Delacroix mansion, just down the west corridor, there was a small room forgotten by everyone. Once intended as a painting studio, it was never used. For years it remained closed, and no one bothered to dust off its covered furniture or look at the paintings stacked against the wall. Mute canvases in frames rusted by time. Until that day. Claire had spent weeks exploring the house with different eyes. Eyes that didn't seek out culprits, but rather knew spaces where calm and memory could dwell. As she opened the door to the old study, the smell of dried turpentine and aged wood greeted her like an old acquaintance she'd never dared invite to dinner. The morning light streamed in through the skylight with surgical precision. Among the sheet-covered canvases, one leaned in a corner, unsigned, undated, and unframed. Claire pulled back the canvas and stood motionless. It was a portrait of her, younger, sitting by a window, with the same serene expression she'd sought for years, in mirrors. The technique was meticulous, almost photographic. The author could only be Lucienne. I didn't remember painting it. Maybe it was in secret. Maybe it was an abandoned project. But the details were intimate. The wedding ring, the gesture of the hand in the lap, the exact curve of the mouth in a half-smile. Claire sat in front of the canvas, silent. Behind the painting on the wooden frame, he found a note taped with yellowish tape. Handwritten, undated. I couldn't hang it up. Not because I don't admire her, but because I don't understand her yet. Maybe one day I will. Or maybe you don't have to understand to love. Claire closed her eyes. She felt that for the first time in years, Lucienne was speaking to her not as a man in doubt, but as someone finally surrendering to the truth of what he had lost. He called Henri that same afternoon. I want to hang this painting. Where? Claire looked around. Then she pointed to the main hallway, where portraits of judges and politicians from the Delacroix family once hung. There, in the centre. No plaque, no date. Let them see it every day. Not as a symbol of power, but of contained doubt. Henri smiled. And the title, he doesn't have one. That's fine. That evening, Henri went down to the office. He turned on the lamp and sat down in front of the new digital archive Claire had installed. It contained all the case documents, the letter from Lucien's mother, the remaining recordings, the recorded testimonies, even a copy of Poirot's notebook that someone in Brussels had sent, without explanation, with a dried rose inside. Henri didn't think about inheritances or genealogies, only about the threads someone had to take care of when the curtain came down. He was the last guardian of a story told in whispers, mistakes, and second chances. Activated voice input and recorded a single new file. The Delacroix mansion has gone from fear to silence, and from silence to meaning. This voice doesn't seek to be reproduced. It only seeks to exist in case someone, sometime in the future, decides to wonder what happened. There are no more guilty parties, only memories, and something more useful than justice, learning. Saved the file under the name Fineco, and sealed it with a password. Then he turned off the light. At his Brussels home, Poirot, already elderly, though still impeccable, received a black folder from a young editor. Claire's letter, now edited into a private memoir, was entitled The Telephone That Called Alone, Correspondences and Reflections. Poirot flipped through the pages, pausing at each one, as if listening not to words, but to emotional overtones. When he reached the epilogue, written by Claire, he remained silent for a few minutes. I don't want this story to be remembered as a crime, nor as a solution, but as an echo that taught us to differentiate between what is said and what is left unsaid. Thank you for teaching us to listen, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot closed the book. He stroked the spine with a finger. Then he placed it on his bookshelf, among Death Visits, the Dentist, and The Mystery of the Railway Guide. So, he said to himself, even echoes know when to stop repeating themselves. Chapter 18. The Echo That Never Lied. Autumn arrived in Chioutier, Paris, like an ancient sigh, with golden leaves blown by the wind, and a clear grey sky that didn't weigh you down, but offered space for reflection. At the Delacroix mansion, the air no longer felt heavy. Doors opened naturally. The hallways didn't whisper, and the silence that had once been suspicious was now a form of peace. Claire walked through the greenhouse with a book in her hands. She no longer needed to be watched. The nights were hers, the early mornings too. She stopped every so often to observe the orchids, the rosebush, Henri's dahlias. There lived a story that didn't need to be told. The story of a house that had outlived itself. That afternoon, he received a letter. It wasn't mysterious nor anonymous. It was signed with the name that best understood the darkness of others, Hercule Poirot, Madame Delacroix. As I closed my file on the events at your home, I reflected on what I'd learned. A man's voice can be manipulated, distorted, even imitated, but what cannot be faked, not for long, is the emotional consequences of his actions. You, Henri, even young Sophie, have responded not with vengeance, but with maturity. That is rarer than brilliant deduction. It is human resolve. I've destroyed the last copy of Lucien's recordings. Only the memory remains. And that, madame, is in noble hands. Thank you for teaching me, a stubborn old Belgian, that not all crimes need a trial. Some just need to be faced. With deep respect, Hercule Poirot. Claire tucked the letter into the pages of her book. She didn't cry. She just smiled, that half-smile of hers that Lucien's portrait had once captured, and which now, hanging in the main hallway, she offered without explanation to anyone who passed by. That same week in Lyon, Sophie Durand took the stage in a small auditorium at the conservatory. It was the first time she had spoken in public since the events at the mansion. The title of her presentation was simple: Voices Without an Owner, Ethics and Technique in Sound Manipulation. A voice, he began, taking a deep breath, is not just a set of frequencies. Its context, its emotional charge, its history. To reproduce it without awareness of its origin is to create a perfect lie. And perfect lies destroy. In the front row, the Dean nodded. The audience remained silent, not out of indifference, but out of respect. I learned that manipulating a sound doesn't just modify a signal, it modifies a memory. And that's why every technique must carry with it a question. So that, at the end, she received a discreet applause. Outside, in the lobby, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Keep talking, Sophie, but now in your own voice. She knew who it was, and she didn't need to confirm it. Henri, for his part, transformed Lucien's office into a community library. There he organized readings, discreet discussions, and donated the family archive to a local history foundation. He never claimed inheritance. He never asked for legal recognition. His signature was still Henri Delacroix, manager of the house. But now he spoke it with a different intonation, like someone naming what he cares for, not what belongs to him. One day, as she placed a book on the top shelf, she discovered a small notebook wedged against the ledge. Upon opening it, she found a sentence written by Lucien. If Henri is who I think he is, then this house is in good hands, because you don't need a last name to be family. He didn't mention it to anyone. He just smiled and put it back in its place. And Poirot, from his desk in Brussels, kept the final version of the case in a black box marked with the letter D. He sealed it with red tape and wrote, "Case closed." Conclusion: technology wasn't the crime. Doubt was. Lesson: even a false voice can lead to authentic truth if you listen with your heart, not your ear. Then, as he was wont to do after finishing a particularly human case, he walked to the window, looked up at the clear afternoon sky, and allowed himself one last thought. Sometimes the detective's greatest triumph is to no longer be needed.